A big part of this, the color theory of how colors appear on a screen versus how they appear on a page. Very, very different. You can see that white text on a blue background has a tendency to be able to be read from a great distance. That's why white on blue or white on green has been so common for road signs, street signs, and the like. It's because of that color contrast, or that contrast between the perceived light or perceived wavelength of light between white and blue or white and green creates a contrast that it can be read from great distances. So consequently, we would probably never do that on print paper. That would be a waste of ink. That would be overwhelming color. But on a screen, this color contrast makes this particular text readable from great distances. The same goes for the opposite, except that the temperature of the room is different. The contrast or the ability to read the text is different if it's black on white versus white on blue, for instance. It's a very different situation from this slide, between this slide and this slide. It also lights up the room, and there's a difference between the readability of something with a color background versus a plain white background. Left brain and right brain with theory has basically been debunked. We don't have a left brain or a right brain. But in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was this thought that there were different perceptions between the left brain and right brain. We still refer to some people as left brain people or right brain people. But in terms of the true brain science and the true brain chemistry, this has been largely debunked. But we still kind of like to separate people into left and right brain thoughts. And so the way that we perceive color has been dropped into these categories as well. Responding emotionally to bright versus intense colors, attaching names to colors, or what is the true nature of the word hue. The word hue refers to the category or name of the color, not its intensity or its saturation. And it was thought that right brain was much more looking at balance and relationships between colors. But that said, in terms of how we see things on a screen, some colors are perceived differently on the screen and have a illusion or perception of depth when cast against each other. So which colors appear to be coming forward, which colors seem to recede more? Okay, so blacks and blues, the cool, what we call the cool colors, tend to recede. And then do the warm colors appear to be closer to us or appear to be jumping off the page? So there is a perception of depth that can start to happen in terms of how these relationships come together and what colors work best on a screen and what they do to the eyes as we look at them in the screen. 90 years ago, 80, 90 years ago, Johannes Itten, who was part of the Bauhaus, published several studies about color relationships and color perception and how different things were grouped together. That gray square in the middle is the same gray square across all of these. Now, there may be a slight difference in terms of how it was photographed or scanned from the book, but at least in theory, that gray square is the same across every single color background. So those relationships between that gray square and the yellow background very different than the gray square versus the indigo background. And it's the same size, it's the same intensity, the same shade across all 6 situations. So a color's context or a figure's context or a letter's context in terms of how it's put onto a color background, it makes a difference in terms of its readability on the screen and in a PowerPoint. This one is very important because those blue squares are the same blue, the same size. But they read so differently, don't they? Against the yellow, against the black, against the green. And this is very important too because the default for all web pages and other web links in PowerPoint is to highlight them in blue, right? Every time you have a web page or web address in PowerPoint or in the Microsoft world, it automatically makes this sort of blue. So is that text going to be visible at all on a slide if you choose to use it in that fashion? And then is any text or any particular figure going to be readable depending on what context it's in. That color contrast becomes very important because if you squint just a little bit, this thing almost disappears against that maroon background versus the color contrast between the blue and the gold, or the blue and the yellow. So color groupings, context, colors that are set against each other, those relationships are important in terms of what leads to our readability. Any perceptions in the difference here? Does one seem to be larger? Okay, so again, the background of the context in which a color, a figure, or a piece of type is important. But yes, those are all the same size, they're all the same hue, all the same saturation, all the same intensity. So that's a little bit of color theory and color relationships that are important to remember as we're starting to build slides. Your show should have some flow to it. Your show should be supporting your verbal presentation, not fighting it. We don't need to put an entire book's worth of information on one slide. Some folks talk about the numbers of slides. Most of my presentations that are 20 minutes in length will sometimes have 125 slides in them. But that's because I use descending lists and because I'm clicking through a group of things in which descending lists or new images are popping up and populating a collage of things. And we'll look at the structure of some of my slideshows later. But it's not the number of slides, it's how we populate them. But it's one slide for every major point that you're trying to make. And too many people put too much information on slides. I think looking at advertising, it's important to observe all the different things that they're doing here. They're basically showing a good relationship between color theory as well as balance and what we might call white space. I don't know why we call it white space, but white space is negative space that balances everything against itself. And this is one big point, one big idea. It's not telling you everything about IKEA's history or its location or anything of that nature. It's just drawing you in with one clear point. So there's something to that, and there's something to using the negative space in the sense of balance here. The object is not centered in the slide. It's actually framed against one side. But if we look at other things like balance and rules of thirds, there's all those things that are happening there. Look how this edge of the file drawer is right at the midpoint of the slide itself, and that creates a line, or what we call a datum that lines up the text against it, and how the logo is always found in the lower right. There's a consistency there to this advertising that tells us some things that we can, bless you, bring into slide design and how slides line up, or how slides might well be used. And so the object is framed or cropped against it. Most of the focus is on one of these, but it's also supported by other information, including, hey, there's more than one color to this, but there's a consistency across these that makes it very pleasant to read, and supports this notion that each slide has a very clear idea, a very clear point. Interesting that they can invert that with a black background, and it works just as well. I use colorful, what we might call bumpers or chapter headings in between groups of information, just as a color interruption. It's like a palette cleanser. So if I have a group of slides that are establishing a certain point and I'm going on to another subject, I'll use a color to really bump that and separate those things. And also, when I translate these things to YouTube, it makes it very easy for a student to slide through that YouTube and find chapters, because that color pops up on the YouTube and then you can stop and enter that. So there's some dynamics in terms of how a PowerPoint reads in an audience, but also how it might translate into YouTube. So that transmutability between PowerPoint and YouTube is interesting for me to share. And so I typically use a really hot color or a noticeable color in between chapters so that that information can be perceived quickly through YouTube. Keeping your slides simple and interchangeable. As an instructor that spends a lot of time building PowerPoints and Frankensteining PowerPoints together, sometimes from 4 or 5 or 6 different sources. Keeping your general slide design simple and transmutable is going to really help you in the future in terms of when you have very little amount of time to put a show together. You're going to be probably bringing slides from other sources and bringing them together from other projects, cramming them together with 10 minutes to go before a presentation. So if you have a consistent slide ethos or slide design throughout your career, it means that all of your slides can come together sometimes at the last minute. So avoid the temptation to use this template for this project and use this template for this project. And oh, here's papyrus font. There's even an SNL sketch about papyrus font now. That creates all these different styles of things. When you bring them together, they're not going to look the same. If you have a clear ethos or a clear consistency early in your career, it means that every PowerPoint show that you build will be able to come together as different pieces in the future. So keeping your slides simple and interchangeable is good. Great stuff. This is from Gensler, a very large architecture and interior design firm. And just the way that they started to build slides, one point per slide, excellent color balance, interesting composition, liberal use of photography taking up this entire half of the slide here, and just using a simple grid to build their shows. And this is a firm that has a graphic designer on staff, so don't get me wrong. But the notion that their slides can be built from different sources or different times and still have a consistency is good for us to remember. A lot of difficulty or different viewpoints about how you structure a presentation. Do you use note cards? Do you use a notepad? Well, there's differing opinions on this, but I'm of the thought that everything that you need to know should already be in your head, and that the slides are supporting that, so that the slide itself is your cue and the slide itself is your reminder. And there's enough room here that you can embed little hints of things. There's also built into the program itself, if you use presenter mode, you've got notes that you can log into or attach to every slide so that you're actually able to read those prompts as you go through it. But we're in a culture that values extemporaneous speaking, values off-the-cuff interaction with the audience. If you go to Europe at conferences, they read their papers to you. It's a very different culture entirely, one that I wasn't prepared for the first time I went to a European conference, and I looked around the room like, is everybody going to read their presentation to us? Yes, they do. It is just a very different culture entirely versus us, which we value this extemporaneous, off-the-cuff, memorized but also internalized form of information and a loose presentation style. Very, very different than the formal engagement of other countries and other situations. Keep in mind too that some conferences, the presenters, English might be their third language, so they're going to rely heavily on their notes, and that's just a form of communication. They're trying to get through this information. They're trying to read it to you in English, and so that's how they're going to present. There's no hands being raised. There's no interruptions, because the speaker is just literally trying to get through the presentation itself in English. But I err on the side, let the slides be your notes, and just let the slides themselves be the structure of the presentation. If you need to build in the notes into the presenter mode, that works well as well. But I've had a few too many students struggle with the note cards and end up getting lost with note cards, and it gets entirely disjointed from the slide presentation entirely. What is readable in a room? This is a great test to think about. Some of you are 12 feet from the screen, some of you are about 24 feet from the screen. And depending on the dynamics of the screen and the environment that you're in community planning and in neighborhood planning, sometimes you have 10 minutes to set up the presentation and the projector and the screen, and you have to adjust the room with the lighting of the room, and sometimes those are things that are not controllable. And so sometimes I feel the bigger the text, the better, because That way, it's assured that your audience can read the text from wherever they're sitting, which might be pretty far away. If you're using 9 to 12 point font on a slide, then only your first row is going to be able to read it. And this is important because your audience can read the slide faster than you can say it. Right? Your audience can always read the presentation faster than you can say it. So that's important to remember as well. As you move from PC to PC, the fonts might be transmutable, they may not. So if you go from a laptop to a station like this and back and forth, the font will change and it will sometimes mess everything up. So keeping your font set simple, or at least understand that as you're transferring from one to the other, you have ways of having a backup and having a way of understanding that the host computer that you're presenting on is going to have the font that you don't. It's been interesting. In this building itself, we've had that problem where even a faculty member will bring in a PowerPoint presentation on a thumb drive. We plug it into a host computer in a room. The host computer doesn't have the font, and the entire presentation is lost just because of that discrepancy again.
Is there a way to know which fonts are transmutable? Because I know the between like transferring from a Mac to a PC.
Yeah.
Well, fonts.
There's some common fonts. There's a group of common fonts that are pretty noticeable. Arial is one. I mean, there's maybe 10 or 12 fonts that are common to both systems that you can rely on. Yeah. The other thing is to just save your presentation as a PDF, so that if you save it as a PDF, it means that the fonts are embedded into the slides, and it means that it will open in Adobe Reader on anything, and the font will be embedded. That's always a nice backup. When I go to a conference, I save a PPT-X, which is the current format. I save a PPT, which is a PowerPoint 2004 file, which is down saving it. I save a PPS, which is a PowerPoint show. PowerPoint show is a file name that automatically opens it as a show, doesn't wait to open up the program itself. And I always save it as a PDF just in case the fonts aren't installed and I want my slides to look exactly as I intended them. I can always click through a PDF with my clicker the same way I would with a PowerPoint show. So I have 4 or 5 files that are on my thumb drive that I open when I go to a conference. That way there's less unpredictability.
So is that also the advantage as by building the slides as successive slides instead of like creating animation
Yes.
in one slide?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can get, just by creating descending lists and by just very simple effects, it negates the need for animations. And even if it's a PDF, it still looks nice and smooth in terms of how things build. Okay. Some things not to do. This is so much information that I had to shrink the font to make it fit. I have a shirt that fit too tight in the shoulders. So there are some things some things to remember. I think I've mentioned this already. Always make a PDF backup, and always cite your sources. Even if it's a shortened version, I mean, it doesn't have to be a full APA or Chicago Manual reference, but if there is a source embedded somewhere in the lower left or the lower right, inevitably, someone is going to ask the question, where's that image from? or who took that? Did you take that? Inevitably. That way you always have an image source somewhere on the slide Secondary to that, if you are taking that slide and putting it into another show someday, that source always lives with that image on that slide. And again, as someone who sometimes takes 3 different PowerPoint shows and makes a new one for a particular student project or a particular lesson, if you have a short source with that image source, you grab that slide and put it into another show, it always lives with it. It always is able to travel with it. Sample PowerPoint plan with descending lists. This PowerPoint file is loaded to Canvas for you to download and take a look at. Let's just go to the work side. You can see this is an 11 slide sample that has a real estate plan starting with the aerial highlighted, and then a real estate plan that has different portions of it highlighted with a bulleted or descending list in the left-hand column. So as you scroll through this plan, you can see that portions of the drawing or the illustrated plan are highlighted in color. The rest are ghosted in black and white or grayscale. Let's start with taking a look at how we can create a highlighted bubble or a highlighted portion of it. We can see a shape here, some sort of quadrilateral or square or rectangle that has a color to it. We build those by starting with the shape tool here. We could pick a variety of shapes to highlight a portion of an aerial or a plan. You can see that that descends down and creates a typical shape fill. We go to shape fill. We pick a color for that particular fill. It assigns the color. But then we have to go to more fill colors to adjust the opacity of that color over the aerial plan. So you can see there, I can make adjustments to the outline of this shape as well as the fill of that shape with the tools up here in the upper bar, the shape outline here. I can add a shape outline. I can adjust the stroke weight of that shape outline if I want to really make that noticeable there, and or no outline at all. That's also where I can control the shape fill color as well as the opacity of that shape fill color. So it's a way of very subtly starting to add emphasis to a portion of the aerial map. Another way for a very difficult shape, we might choose the freeform tool in the shape menu. That freeform tool allows me to make a very unique shape to a real estate or property situation. We'll just make a tracing here, just as we would in Adobe Illustrator, of a freeform shape that then fills in like so. I then will go back to the shape fill menu, go to more, pick a color, and then go to more fill colors to adjust the opacity of that particular shape. Take that down to 45% or so, and it will leave a subtle highlight color over a portion of that aerial. So as you click from the aerial to this, we can see that by duplicating the slide and by adding this additional color, that it will scroll through to our audience as looking at the aerial itself and then a very subtle highlight of a particular area. We do that by placing the aerial, duplicating the slide, and then adding the shape to highlight that portion of the map. That serves as a transition to the illustrated plan drawing. So as we go from this to this might very well highlight to our audience the portion of the map that we're actually working through. And by adding then street names and names of landmarks or known buildings, we can really help orient our audience to the map, to the focus area, and to the real estate infill proposals that we're starting to make. We always like to include at least 2 cross streets, so cross of Madison and Charles Street, 2 streets that cross each other. You can see I've added Howard here just to create some bearing and orientation. Anyone viewing this slideshow or this presentation can Google that particular intersection and be brought to it in Google Maps very quickly. I also have set up here a series of descending lists, bullet point 1, bullet point 2, bullet point 3, and then leading to another focus area. How I do that, I take a portion of the map, make a copy of it, and then using the crop tool under picture format,
I'm able to crop out a portion of the fully rendered illustrated plan and navigate that around and adjust that accordingly as it floats over the other existing map. So it looks like it's floating right directly above it. And it allows us to create focus against a grayscale or ghosted version of that image. Let me show you how I do that. So that my fully illustrated plan, it might be labeled, it might be unlabeled, whatever. I select the picture itself, make a copy of it, paste it in place. PowerPoint will automatically send it a little bit off center, so I want to readjust it, put it right back where it needs to be, like so. And then under Arrange, I send it all the way to the back. So that now is a copy of the fully rendered illustrated plan sent to the back. I then will take now what is now the foreground. There's another copy of it floating here in the foreground. I will crop that down to a particular focus area. And as you can see, that is just floating above the other map. So there's two copies of this illustrated plan, one here and one here. They're now floating, one floating above the other. I then will click on the background version of that and go to either color or to corrections. There's a number of options here, as well as artistic effects that are probably a little bit too eccentric perhaps for our audience. But if I just go to color correction, I can pick a soft ghosting of that color. Here's a blue-gray accent 2 color. Here's a blue-gray. Here's a grayscale version. So I think I'm going to pick one of these here, probably to be consistent with my color theme, and that will take the background image and will ghost it as part of that color pairing with its background. So this foreground plan now is sitting here in between the text, which is on top, the portion of the illustrated plan here. The background plan is in the back now, has been color corrected. So what that does is it creates focus on a particular part of the plan that we want to bring attention to. And consequently, you can use a descending list over here on the right-hand side to start to point to portions of the plan and call out specific features, whether it be parking, infill, housing, or parks or open space, or the cultural trail, which is running through here. As I work with this, I now have the ability to duplicate this particular slide. I have to go to the work menu, come back to the slide here, and then duplicate. I can select that slide and then duplicate it. That slide is now duplicated, and I can come back to this portion of the plan, go to picture format, grab the crop tool, and I can move the crop. So I can readjust the crop to now focus on another portion of the plan, then create a call out or bulleted list on the right hand column, which allows me now to create focus to two different portions of the plan and bring our audience's attention to a particular portion of the plan. So again, we can see how we've done that here in the example with supporting bullet points, which may have leader lines or call outs that help orient folks to specific elements or portions of our illustrated plan proposal. Full color rendering portion of the plan floating on top of a ghosted portion of the plan helps create focus and emphasis to portions of the plan as you walk through it and share it with your audience. With descending lists, I've got a very simple PowerPoint with black and white and Helvetica font, a lot of images and some larger text blocks, just to show you how we build this out. The first slide in a group or a descending list like this would look something like this. It has every image placed and cited with a citation of how all these different images might come together and populate the full slide. What I typically do then is build the slide out with all the text and images and then duplicate the slide and deconstruct it. So what I'll do is duplicate the slide, delete one image. I will duplicate the slide again, delete another image, duplicate the slide again, delete the third image, duplicate the slide once again, and delete that final image. So as we read this now, this starts to read as a descending list or a group of ascending images as we click through it. We build out the slide first in totality, we duplicate it several times, and we deconstruct it. It then is able to be read like so. So this would be the first slide in this particular sequence. We have an introduction to the subject material. We have a citation. Those all remain in place as we duplicate the slide. But then we can, as we click through, each time we click the space bar or the forward key or your clicker, those images will then come in and then populate the entire slide. Transitions are fairly simple. I simply have the fade transition. If we look at transitions, I have the fade transition, the simplest of all of the transitions. A lot of these can be quite wild and quite distracting, but PowerPoint has a lot of different transitions available to you. But the fade transition creates this very simple fade, which makes the images appear like an old school slideshow from the 1970s or 1980s, which gives it kind of a retro look, but a very simple, minimalist look. Each of them is set for 0.7 seconds. That is the default for PowerPoint. You can set that for as many seconds or portions of a second as you wish. And then if you have several slides together or the entire slideshow, you click Apply to All and it will apply that transition to the entire show. So again, with the simple fade transition at 0.7 seconds, our sequence of slides looks like this. Click, 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 and click. So if I have a cluster of images or a group of images that want to populate an entire slide, I will be talking over those slides as I click through them with my clicker finger. For a larger text box, for a larger text situation, a lot of text will look something like this. I will not read it to the audience, but I will take portions of it and either break it up, a large paragraph, and break it up over successive slides, or even break it up on 2 slides so that folks can read through that faster than I can say it. So, but there are portions of the text, such as this portion of this text here, that are actually my prompt or my notes. So as I click through the slide, that is the reminder of what I'm talking about relative to this text. I'm going to let my audience read it themselves, but I'm going to talk over it and add anecdotes or add a reflection on what the text is saying based on what is highlighted here. That is my cue, that is my prompt as the speaker of what I want to talk about as they read the text themselves, because our audience can always read text faster than we can say it. So these are ways of structuring the slides so that they are able to read it, but that there's a hint of what I want to talk about or talk over as they read the quote for themselves. So text boxes like this might look like something like this. I will use the duplicate slide tool to help place the text in the same place and keep titles floating like so. You can see I'm using sort of a uniform composition of large subject lines as well as paragraphs that are approximately, if we look at highlight the font here, we're at 18-point font here, so that an average audience in an average room can read the text from where they're sitting. If this is projected in a large room on a very large screen, 18-point font to 24-point font, anywhere from 18 to 24 is a good range for folks to be able to read text on their own on a particular slide. Again, depending on the room, depending on the situation, depending on the projector. Other situations, we may have interesting images that we actually want to talk through. This image here comparing this $10,000 worth of equipment in 1993 versus the iPhone in 2013 might actually be an image that has more power if I split it up like so. So that's a situation where I will create the slide, duplicate the slide, and then crop the image down to create a more powerful transition between the top half of the image and the bottom half of the image, kind of illustrating the point of how much has changed in that 20-year period. So those are how I use the duplicate slide tool, as well as cropping images, layering images, and clustering images and text to create the impression of descending lists. One more here. This is a fairly long testimony here. What I've done is I've broken it up into 2 slides. kept the citation for the student's name in the lower left, but the first half of the paragraph here can be read by the audience. The second half of the paragraph has a prompt for me as well as a focus for the audience. I gray out the first part of the text. I use white and orange to create focus for the second part of the text. So building out the slide here in totality, and then duplicating the slide, deleting portion of the text, and changing its color creates a transitional focus to the second part of the paragraph, if it's a long testimony or a long paragraph like so. And as we click through it on the show, it looks something like this. So you can see that subtlety. If your audience has not read through the whole thing, they will not lose the totality of the text that you're asking them to read, but you are keeping them on pace in terms of how much they can read between two successive slides, as opposed to reading all of it on one slide. So some nice tricks that I use, some techniques that I use. The duplicate slide tool, which is a very powerful tool located underneath the edit menu, and then building a total slide and then deconstructing it, whether it be a text or collage of images, are how I structure most of my presentations. 605 from fall of 19. This is by student Esra Arar. This is her presentation for modules 4 and 5. So if we just click through it, we can see a title slide with her company logo, called Community Direction, name of the agency or nonprofit that she has created for the purpose of this development. This was done with several icon pieces from the icons pack in Illustrator, and she also picked a font that would unify the entire presentation. She probably used a template from PowerPoint or from the web to help structure the presentation as well. She starts with an aerial, so this portion of West Charles Street. She floats a titles of or names of streets over that. Then a focus area using a transparent quadrilateral shape in PowerPoint. Then flips to her illustrated plan with a large red bar on the side, which she will have a series of descending lists. So as we click through, each click will have leader lines pointing out specific areas of the plan. And you can see also that she has grayed out the portion of the plan that we're not focusing on. So as we click through the plan and click through the explanations of each portion of the plan, you can see that that is illustrated in full color. The rest is in grayscale. She has the land use colors as a legend for each slide. She's calling out land uses and square footages. Graying out the text here just creates more emphasis to the text which she's focusing on, helps her structure her presentation. Esra ended with all of her real estate estimates based on possible generated revenue if the plan were to be fully occupied in terms of parking spaces, retail space, and apartments, including the variety of housing types and the possible revenue generated were it to be fully occupied, fully rented, and fully maxed out in terms of its highest and best use.